All right, well, it's 2:03, so I think we can go ahead and get started, and we may have a few more people joining. But welcome, everyone, to this update on federal funding from the Oregon Department of Energy. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Janine Benner, and I'm the director at the department. And we are really pleased to be able to offer the second update on energy-related federal funds available to Oregon under both the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We held our first public webinar back in July of 2022, and that was actually before the Inflation Reduction Act passed. So we're excited to share with you an update on how we are pursuing and preparing for some of this federal funds. I'm joined today by a few additional ODO staff. Jen Senner, who is our federal grants officer, will be co-presenting with me. Ruchi Sadir, our Associate Director for Strategic Engagement, will be helping to monitor the chat and look for raised hands. And then Stacy Heiberger will be our host and will run the polling functions. And there are some other ODO staff on the line as well, so I would ask them to introduce themselves in the chat while we are going through these initial slides. All right, Jen, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. So here's a reminder on how to use WebEx. It may be new to some of you. Please note that only the presenters today will have their cameras on and the ability to mute and unmute themselves. If you have a question to ask during this presentation, please go ahead and put it in the chat or raise your hand and we will call on you. The raise your hand button can be found either by your name in the participants list or at the bottom of your screen in the reactions button. And when you do raise your hand, once we call on you, the host will unmute you to ask your question. For those of you on the phone, you can raise your hand by using *3, and you can unmute yourself by pressing *6. Again, that's *3 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute yourself. And then if you do put a question in the chat, please go ahead and select that it goes to everyone or all panelists. That way, the right people will be able to see your question and respond to it. So I'll let folks take a look at this slide. Okay, thank you. Moving on to the agenda. For today's webinar, our objectives are there on the right. We want to share the latest information. There's a lot happening and a lot changes very quickly, so we're going to share with you what we know. And we also want to hear your questions and comments, and we will answer as many of those as we can at this time. And I do want to just share that we're not going to be able to answer everything today. So much of what's happening is happening as we speak. The federal agencies that are putting out these funding opportunities are still working on them. So we're not going to be able to answer all the questions, but we'll answer what we can. We'll be covering general information on federal grants, including the size, scope, and purpose of the funds, and information on the Biden-Harris administration's Justice 40 initiative. We'll provide some context on how federal grants work generally. We'll talk about our past engagement with communities and stakeholders, and we'll share our direction moving forward as we bring in federal funds. We'll provide an overview of ODO's current monitoring of opportunities. Lastly, we'll cover how you can stay informed as each of these opportunities progresses. Next slide, please. So we'd actually like to start by learning a little bit more about you, our audience. So please introduce yourself by typing your name and any organizational affiliation that you might have into the chat. And that way everyone can see who's joining us today. And again, if you don't mind, please address that chat to everyone. And if you have trouble finding your chat, it's the little, I don't know what that symbol is, little button to the right bottom of your screen. Okay, and then we're also going to ask a few questions through the WebEx polling feature so that we can get to know our audience better. All right. As we're doing this, feel free to continue putting your name in the chat, but Stacy, go ahead and launch that first poll. All right, so if you all are seeing what I'm seeing, a little box opened up that says Slido, and it should have federal funding public webinar with our first question, which is, what is your relationship to this federal funding? So we want to know what brings you here today. Are you a local government representative interested in seeking federal funds? Do you work for a utility? Are you a member of the public who's interested in learning what's happening? So you'll see some options there, and we ask that you fill in the button that is closest to what corresponds with the reason you're here. And if you select other, feel free to characterize your specific interest in the chat. And I will give folks just a few minutes to fill that in. And then after you click your choice, you may need to scroll down and press send. So until you press send, it's not going to show up on our end. So I'm starting to see some responses come in. Thank you very much. And maybe we'll just give another 10 seconds for folks to answer that question. All right, Stacy, let's go ahead and move to our next question. While that's loading, again, thank you so much for filling that out and for introducing yourselves in the chat. Looks like we've got a really great group of folks on the line today. Thank you for taking the time this afternoon. Okay, here's our next question. How familiar are you with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the CHIPS and Science Act? Is this the first time you're hearing of them? Maybe you've heard of them, but you don't really know what they do. You're somewhat familiar, or like me and Jen, you've been living and breathing them for the past few months. Okay, thanks so much for filling that out. Looks like we've got the majority of folks who are somewhat familiar with all or one of them. And some folks that are new to them, which is great. Okay, Stacy, let's give folks maybe 5 more seconds. Oh, okay, or we'll be done. That works too. All right, we've got one more. No, that's it. Do we have one more question? One more question. What are you most interested in getting out of today's webinar? Okay, question is live. Go ahead and fill it out. Don't forget to scroll down and press send so that your response can be registered. What are you most interested? Do you want to understand how these funds will affect Oregon in general? Do you want to learn about the Justice 40 initiative at the federal level? Do you want to know what sort of incentives may be available to individuals, households, tribal governments, community-based organizations? Are you interested in learning about what the Oregon Department of Energy is doing? I'm glad to see that a majority is interested in finding out what programs will be administered by ODO, because that is what we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about. And we'll give people 10 more seconds to fill this out. Okay. Thank you very much for participating in those polls. It's really great for us to know who's in the audience and how to maybe tailor some of this webinar. And then this will also be helpful as we go back and look at the recording and think about what we at Odo are learning during this webinar to see who's here and what your interests are. All right, next slide, please. And with this next slide, I'm going to introduce Jen Center, our federal grants administrator, to talk about the scope of the funds coming our way.
Great, well, thank you. Happy to be here today. So the federal funds that we're focused on in this webinar come from two different pieces of legislation. First, there was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was passed with bipartisan support in November of 2021. And this legislation focuses on our nation's infrastructure, and it funded more than 380 distinct federal programs across multiple federal agencies. Some of those programs happen to be related to our energy systems. And then the second piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, was passed using a process known as budget reconciliation on a partisan basis. This legislation passed through as part of this process, and as a result of that, it was focused primarily on taxing and spending provisions. And so what that means is, as a result, some of the Inflation Reduction Act text is limited to pretty much focusing on the direct funding rather than how exactly these programs will be rolled out. And as a result of that, we are still waiting on quite a bit of guidance from different federal agencies, particularly under the Inflation Reduction Act, as they work to fill in the gaps left behind as a result of that streamlined text process that was needed by Congress in order to move this into law. I'll also note that the Inflation Reduction Act focuses on health and medical programs and energy and climate programs, and it uses a variety of tax measures and grant programs. So just to put these two pieces of legislation into context, here is a slide that was prepared by RMI. It shows the spending by federal agencies on these topics at different time periods. The chart puts into perspective the moment in which we find ourselves. You can see that the three pieces of legislation of the funding that's available is more than what would double that was available during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. At this moment, we're in the very early stages of ushering new programs and increased funding into our state agency, but also into other eligible entities and grant programs and financing programs. Not all of this funding will flow through the Oregon Department of Energy, however. Different programs will have different eligible applicants. And for example, we don't anticipate any funds from the CHIPS and Science Act to be available to the state energy offices, but the funds from that particular law will likely support research for new or improved technologies, which will just foster the energy environment in which we're working. The available funding under these pieces of legislation will be program and purpose specific, that's based on the federal law that authorized it. Beyond the specific programs we'll talk about more in depth later into this presentation, I want to emphasize that there's a wide variety of funding opportunities to support energy and climate projects across all different types of applicants. This slide highlights some of the opportunities available under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding. If you're with a local government, business, or organization considering applying for these funds, we want to encourage you to begin researching and preparing for the opportunity as soon as possible. And we'll later share how you can request formal letters of support from the Oregon Department of Energy if required in that endeavor. Similarly to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act covers numerous programs across multiple federal agencies. These are the different categories of funding available under the Inflation Reduction Act, specific for the energy and climate portion. Each category may represent numerous specific grant opportunities or tax credits. So just to highlight the historic scale of the Inflation Reduction Act, each one of those numbers in each of those boxes above ends in a B for billions. And that's part of the scale and the size of the moment in which we find ourselves. I also think that it's important to note that this is the largest investment under the Inflation Reduction Act for Energy and Climate comes through the form of tax credits offered through the US Treasury. And you can see that they are estimating that value there at $277 billion. For the funds that are expected to be released in the form of federal grants, there's a unique pathway for each grant opportunity. But it's my hope with this slide that perhaps we can share a general overview of a typical process of a federal grant and how that interacts at the state level. But I do want to mention that each grant will vary somewhat in the exact steps. In general, after the federal law is enacted, the federal agency will take a look and review the legislation, and if needed, establish a program at the federal level. The federal agency may solicit feedback on the new program through listening sessions or a more formal process known as a request for information. And it's through that interested parties can be invited to respond to targeted questions and share their thoughts on how the program could be designed. When the federal agency is ready, they will announce the funding opportunity announcement. Whether it's through a formal FOA, funding opportunity announcement, or something that's called an administrative and legal requirements document, that is essentially the announcement that the application period is now open. And at this point, potential applicants will have probably the best source of information to evaluate the terms and conditions of the award and determine whether the purpose of the grant aligns with the projects they'd like to see move forward. During the application process, the federal agency may provide additional clarification or guidance to applicants as they go. Applicants can then prepare the materials required and submit that to the federal agency. If awarded, these materials effectively become part of the scope of work in any future award agreement. As a state agency, there's an important step before or after submission of the application. The state agency must seek approval from the state legislature to apply for the federal grant. Now, the exact timing and process of how this occurs varies based on the legislative schedule. From there, the federal agency will, after it receives applications, will process it as a procurement activity. Sometimes that occurs as part of a formula award where it is more of a compliance check to make sure the application aligns, or a competitive review in which the applications would be ranked against each other. This process can take several months before an award agreement is offered. And once that award agreement is fully offered and executed, then that's the point in time when the work of the grant can actually begin. As a state agency, we may need to return to the legislature again at that point in time to request authority to spend the funds and to hire any additional positions that are needed related to that funding. Now, the Biden-Harris administration is seeking to invest federal dollars so that the benefits serve communities that have been historically disadvantaged. Under Executive Order 14008, the Biden-Harris administration is seeking to provide that 40% of the benefits of these funds serve disadvantaged communities. This complements the administration's comprehensive approach to advance equity in line with Executive Order 13985. There's also broader considerations for community benefits, specifically seeking to integrate benefits related to labor and workforce at the community level as part of a community benefits plan. And so we're seeing aspects of the Justice 40 initiative in every grant application that's being offered. Now, under the Justice 40 initiative, each federal agency may approach this a little bit differently. And I wanted to note this is particularly relevant where there's a natural intersection between the work of different federal agencies. For example, the Department of Transportation and the U.S. Department of Energy may approach Justice 40 definitions and tracking a little bit differently. So for a topic like installation of electric vehicle chargers and charging infrastructure, it's important to understand which federal agency is leading the effort to understand what the Justice 40 approach will look like. The U.S. Department of Energy has issued general guidance for Justice 40, but they noted that each grant opportunity may have specific guidance directed towards it as to how Justice 40 will be interpreted for that unique program or grant. In general, we anticipate using a map called the CGEST map, which we'll review on the next slide. Although there may be some opportunities for states to use a predefined state tool for this purpose, if the data can be reliably compared and tracked to the existing map. And we are also, through the EPA, they are taking a programmatic specific approach to Justice 40, and you can learn more about that by following the link that is on the slides to the EPA's website. Now, I had mentioned the CGEST map, which is an acronym that stands for the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. And this is available from the White House. The areas shaded in gray on this map are census tracts identified as disadvantaged communities by this tool. Some of the darker gray areas indicate where tribal lands are located as well. While in the tool, it can provide census tract level classification of whether or not a community meets the definition of disadvantaged. You can see in the box that is pulled out here the level of detail that you can observe from the tool if you zoom into the Medford, Oregon area, for example. So you can get right down to the neighborhood view using this tool. All right, so next I'm going to hand this back over to Janine to talk about some of the places we've been and some of the things we've been thinking about as we've been considering how to prepare for these funds.
Great, thank you, Jen. We are so lucky to have Jen help us navigate all of these opportunities. So as we apply for, spend, and disperse the federal funds, we think it's crucial to engage Oregonians to inform, consult, and collaborate. We really appreciate the folks who've engaged with us so far, and we're really glad to be meeting with you all today. On this slide is a summary of some of the ways that we've connected with communities and stakeholders over the last year. So we started with 2 public webinars back in July of 2022, along with sharing information on our website, newsletters, and blog. Ruchi has been putting some links in the chat to where you can find some of this information on our website. We've held discussions with our Energy Advisory Work Group, and we've met with representatives from investor and consumer-owned utilities. We've also conducted outreach to tribal governments. We dove deeper into workforce issues and a special discussion that stemmed from an EAWG meeting. And we held a listening session with community-based organizations representing environmental justice communities. We've also presented to legislative task forces and committees. So we've tried to get the word out there about the general opportunities. And then we've also held public meetings and discussions on specific funding opportunities such as grid resilience and the hydrogen hub. From all of this engagement so far, we condensed what we heard into a number of guiding principles, which I'll show in a second on the next slide. But we hope to apply the guiding principles to our decision-making surrounding these opportunities. They will help us determine what to apply for and then how to spend the funds that we receive. It will also help us tailor federal guidance to work best for Oregon. Next slide, please, Jen. All right, so here are those draft guiding principles that we intend to apply during our approach to federal funding available under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. So under these principles, we will consider equity at every step, including geographic diversity. And this will help ensure that the funds comply with the Biden-Harris administration's Justice 40 initiative that you heard about from Jen a few minutes ago. We will try to coordinate with tribal governments and will work to communicate clearly, inclusively, and efficiently to ensure stakeholders and the public are informed and supported, and that they're able to participate in federal funding opportunities. Where possible and where internal resources allow, we hope to provide technical assistance to build community capacity and support grant recipients. There's actually a position and a program funded in the governor's budget to help us do this. We're working across agencies to leverage expertise and support historically underinvested work to further energy and climate goals and to provide other community benefits. And we're also trying to take advantage of high priority funding opportunities while ensuring quality work that puts every available dollar to its best use. And with that, we'd like to pause and ask you, does this ring true? What's missing? Do you have a reaction to this? You're welcome to put any thoughts you have in the chat or raise your hand and we will call on you to share your perspective. And I will give it some awkward silence while we're waiting for folks to either type or raise their hands. Don't see any.
So far. Janine, I'll just put in the chat a reminder that you can just type right in there if you have thoughts.
And these really are helpful for us to go back to with each new funding opportunity that comes out as we're putting together our application, or we're thinking, there are so many opportunities and we know that we're not going to be able to take advantage of every single one. It's a bit overwhelming, but these guiding principles and then the sort of feedback and comments from the public and interested parties that we've heard throughout our engagement is really helping us determine, how we're going to use this money. Okay,
so
thank you.
Comments in the chat here and a question. One is an idea that we should be always including goals of leveraging other dollars or enable some sort of rating of funds to get those outcomes. And then there's a question about the fourth bullet and whether ODO is partnering with state agencies only or if nonprofit partnerships could be explored as well.
Great questions. Yes and yes. And I think those two are related because we know there's so much great work happening in other state agencies and from nonprofit and other partners in the state. And we want to make sure that we're building on that and we're leveraging that work to get even more federal dollars our way. So actually in a few slides towards the end, I'm going to talk about a specific area of collaboration that we have been doing with Oregon Housing and Community Services and Energy Trust of Oregon, looking at the federal funding coming for home energy efficiency upgrades and electric appliance rebates. And that is an area where, as we put together the application and design the program, we're going to be relying heavily on advice and guidance from other entities in the state, public and private, who work on those things already.
Great. There's one other comment in the chat about wondering about community benefit and targeting highest risk reductions.
Another good question that we are working on specifically as it applies to the grid resilience funding. So Rob Del Mar is on the line, introduced himself as being ODO's point person, putting together an application for funding that will come through ODO that we would then distribute to utilities and others to work on grid resilience, making the grid more resilient against natural and man-made disasters. And one of the things that we have to do in that application is really to articulate how are we determining the greatest community benefit and how are we targeting risk reduction. And so that's something that we've asked and have been working with our utility partners on, and we'll be having a public hearing on our potential approach, I think, next month. So that's information on that will come at the end of the presentation. Then I see
one question from Kathy about approach using to coordinate with tribal governments. Hi, Kathy. So glad you're here from Warm Springs. One of the things that we do, and I'll let Janine and Jen weigh in too, is that we try to use both formal and informal channels to work with both the tribal councils, the elected tribal councils that may be interested in sending sort of formal notification and opportunities to coordinate, as well as more informal reaching out to staff through the Legislative Commission on Indian Services, as well as sort of, just sharing information as we have it out from a staff to staff level, but we're really open to whatever approach works best for each individual tribe. So if there's suggestions, Kathy, we would love to hear what would work best for Warm Springs. Jen or Janine, you're welcome to add to that too.
I think that was great, Ruchi. I would just add, with some of the funds that are coming to Odo, there's similar funds coming directly to tribal governments, and we'd like to both play an inform role and also technical assistance role on that, because I know tribes have varying levels of resources available to put together applications and really research these opportunities. So that's an area that gets to that point about providing technical assistance where we can.
Great. One more question about plans to collaborate with local governments, if any. And then kind of a more specific one about households looking for a consumer regulator.
Yeah, Ruchi, maybe I'd turn the tribal government question back to you, but maybe I'll start by saying we definitely have plans, especially on some of the specific funding opportunities that Jen will talk about in a minute. Energy efficiency and conservation block grants. Some will be going directly to local governments. Some will be coming through Odo for the smaller governments. I think there will be an opportunity with some of the climate change funding coming through EPA, which is available to both the state and local communities. And we know that a lot of local governments have climate action plans of their own. So there are definitely plans, and we have just brought in a new staff person to help us with this. We're hoping to bring in an additional person in the near future, really to focus on getting the word out there and facilitating work done by local communities.
Great. I think that there's a couple of points about particular funding streams like Homes and HERA, about administration. Maybe we can get to that at that stage. I think there's a slide on Homes and HERA, unless you want to talk a little bit about administration. And then some suggestions around for technical assistance, also including clear guidance and communication to Oregon households. You know, even if it's information about other state agencies or non-IRA resource or incentives.
Yep, great. I think if it's all right, maybe we'll hold those till we get to the specific programs that will address those questions. And
Great.
so, thank you for those questions and that feedback. We'll move to the next slide, which is with all of that context, you are probably wondering, so what are all of these opportunities and how is Odo tracking and applying for those? So the next part of the presentation is specifically focused on opportunities that are related to state energy offices like Odo. And for that, I will turn it back over to Jen. Oh, no, not yet. First, I'm going to introduce this amazing chart that Jen produced that identifies some of the individual grant programs that we're tracking at this time. So as you can see on the right of this slide, of the hundreds of millions of dollars potentially coming to Oregon, so far what we've received is $200,000. And that is specifically through the state energy program to support the development of an energy security plan. I say that in part to give you a sense that this money, even though the bills passed with IIJA over a year ago, it takes time to get the money through the federal process, and then it will take time to get the money through the state process. So I think a lot of folks are working as hard and fast as they can. But so far, what we've received is $200,000. We also have a pending application submitted for the remaining balance of the State Energy Program funds, that's what SEP stands for, under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And there are currently a handful of open opportunities and then many more opportunities to the left-hand side of that slide that are still in planning phases with federal agencies. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jen to talk through what those other opportunities are and the timing that we are aware of so far.
Well, as Janine shared, we have prepared and submitted an application for 5.6 million in funding from the state energy program. And the funds from this program will be used to support the department's energy security planning work. It will increase our ability to provide technical assistance to consumers and communities, as well as to facilitate research, analysis, and programs on energy efficiency, renewable energy, sustainable transportation, and resilient energy systems, following the time that we receive that final award agreement. And so we are hopeful that we will actually receive that award agreement within the next couple of months for that one. Another opportunity that we are pursuing is seeking funding through the Grid Resilience Formula grants. Overall, we anticipate that Oregon will receive approximately $50 million over the next 5 years to help make Oregon's electric grid more resilient. Our application is due to USDOE on March 31st of 2023 for the first 2 years worth of funding under that program. So for this program, we will be asking the state legislature for general funds to meet the state match requirement. Utilities will be receiving this funds through ODO and potentially others, and they will be subject to matching fund requirements as well. And so with this, just a note, we will also be having a public meeting on this in approximately a month, I believe on March 15th, but we'll get the date and time shown on a later slide here. All right, we are also in the early planning stages for 2 different rebate programs known as the HOMES and HERA programs. And these can provide rebates for residential upgrades. While there's a lot we still don't know about these funds, we anticipate we will be submitting an application for them either in the summer or the fall, and that the funds will be available in either late 2023 or early 2024 to support these residential upgrades related to homes. We also know that workforce development is an important topic right now, and we are actively planning to apply for 2 different grants in support of this need. One opportunity to support is related to supporting the training of energy auditors, and the other could support the training of contractors who will be assisting with the implementation of the residential energy efficiency upgrades through the HOMES and HERA programs that I just mentioned. Beyond those specific opportunities, there may be ways to foster workforce development in the course of other projects as well. And we'll be thinking about this work as we design our programs and consider specific needs, as we know it'll take a well-developed workforce to get these projects done. Related to opportunities in the clean hydrogen space, ODO is participating in the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association to host a hydrogen hub in the Pacific Northwest. The association submitted a concept paper, and that concept paper was encouraged by USDOE to submit a full application. We're aware of additional hydrogen hub applications from Oregon as well. The full application is due in April of 2023. I will note that although we're participating in this association, this is just one pathway to attract hydrogen funding to Oregon, which is our primary goal. The Inflation Reduction Act also included tax credits for the production of hydrogen, especially renewable hydrogen. The Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant will invest directly in community-level investments, both through direct awards from the USDOE and subawards that will flow through the Oregon Department of Energy. The application for entities eligible for a direct award is now open, and we will apply for state funding no later than July 31st, 2023. But other entities that are eligible for that direct award, they may have a longer time frame to apply. And with the portion that the Oregon Department of Energy expects to receive, we expect a substantial part of that to go out in direct subawards for local governments as well. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, the US EPA has 2 programs designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Under the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund, there is $5 billion to plan and implement those plans to reduce emissions. Odo and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality are working closely to prepare for this opportunity, particularly where these funds can build on existing state policies and programs. There is also a significant fund called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Well, information was released yesterday on both of these fundings with webinars hosted today by the US EPA. I will note that they are still working on producing the full guidance for both of these programs and expect to have it released in the next few weeks or few months. And we are actively participating in conversations on how Oregon can access these funds, and that could involve a process to establishing financing programs through a green bank. We do anticipate that applications will open for these programs in various forms sometime in the first half of 2023. All right. So in regards to some of the programs that we mentioned, I'll turn this back over to Janine to talk about an example of how we are thinking through and collaborating specifically around residential energy efficiency upgrades.
Thank you, Jen. So as we prepare to take advantage of some of those opportunities that Jen just mentioned, especially the energy efficiency rebates, we're thinking through how to align them with each other and with existing programs at the state level. So this is coming back to one of the questions that was asked earlier. The example is that we've been working closely with Oregon Housing and Community Services, the Energy Trust of Oregon, and others who work in the weatherization and energy efficiency space to make sure that the new programs build on and complement existing programs. One of our first steps in this collaborative effort was to agree on some shared intentions to guide our work. So as we get into program design details, we want to constantly be able to go back and remind ourselves what we're trying to do with these programs. So this slide shows our draft strategic intentions for the home energy efficiency and electrification rebate programs. And I won't go through them all, but I do want to highlight a few, especially since there have been questions on this. We want to make the programs as easy and accessible for consumers as possible. So we want to take a whole of government approach and have integrated eligibility where possible. And this means we'll need to design the programs to make sure they're easy for consumers to use. We'll need to meet people where they are. We want to prioritize customer service, and that will probably include meeting some humans to interact and provide assistance. Another way to think about this is that we want consumers to experience a one-stop shop, in that they shouldn't have to call 5 different agencies or organizations to get the information they need or to figure out which programs that they're eligible for. So actually, in addition to providing new funding and allowing us to set up new programs, we're sort of viewing this as an opportunity to create alignment and efficiencies within the existing programs in the state. And Representative Pam Marsh actually has a bill that she's introduced to facilitate this effort, and I think that might be up in committee next week. So if you're curious about this topic, I'd encourage you to pay attention in the House Climate and Energy Committee. All right, next slide, please. So Jen mentioned the $277 billion in tax credits that are available through the Inflation Reduction Act. These are available now. These don't need to go through a state agency process. They don't need to go through a federal agency process other than IRS putting together guidance. So these are available now, and this slide doesn't include the whole list, but it does include a small subset of tax credits that are available to Oregonians. So there are tax credits available for residential upgrades, for industry and commercial entities. There are even opportunities for nonprofit and government entities to benefit from a direct pay option under these credits. So normally you'd have to have a tax appetite to get a tax credit, but the Inflation Reduction Act changed that so that local governments or consumer-owned utilities can actually take advantage of the benefits of these tax credits. The Oregon Department of Energy does not offer tax advice, but we do recommend researching further into the guidance available from the IRS about these credits or consulting a licensed tax preparer for advice. And our website includes some additional resources. I heard this funding described last week by someone from USDOE as the wind behind our backs on this stuff. So I think the tax credits are pretty exciting. Next slide, please. All right, so we're gonna come back to a poll, another poll. Now that we've shared some information, we're interested in hearing from you on the topics covered today. Which would you like to learn more about? Please go ahead and check all that apply. So you can see it come up under Slido. Don't forget to check your areas of interest and then scroll down and press send so that we are able to register your response. Looking at some of the responses coming in. Lots of interest in energy efficiency and electrification, grid resilience, energy planning and analysis. We'll give folks another 15 seconds or so to answer this question. For those of you interested in grid resilience, we have a specific public hearing coming up that Jen mentioned on March 15th. All right, Stacy, thank you. Go ahead and close that and we'll move on to the next one. So while it's loading, the next question is, what do you think Odo should focus on most when applying for federal funds? And for this, we'd ask you to please pick your top 3 selections only. So go ahead and choose 3 things from this list and scroll down and press send. And then you see there's an other option there. If you don't see your priority on there, feel free to type it in the chat for us. And I will highlight that in 3 more slides, we're going to have just an open time for questions. So we will come back to some questions. Okay, it looks like a lot of people are interested in making things easy and accessible for consumers. As a consumer, I appreciate that. Neck and neck with maximizing the funding and resources available through the entire enterprise of government. A lot of interest in coordination and collaboration for sure. All right, we'll give folks 10 more seconds. All right, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Okay, next question. Did you find this webinar helpful? We're not at the end of the webinar yet, so maybe we'll get even more helpful with the Q&A portion, but oh, you know what? Sorry, that's not a question. We'll come back to that. What's your biggest concern about federal funding? Again, please go ahead and pick your top 3. I jumped ahead. Okay, looks like resource navigation and awareness of resources is coming in at the top, followed by knowledge or capacity to apply for or administer federal funding. Definitely workforce availability. You want to make sure we have the people to do this work. Let me give folks another 5 seconds. All right, thanks, Stacy. And then I think if it's possible, maybe we can wait on the last 3 to the last slide. Okay. Next slide, please. So Ruchi has put this link in the chat a few times, I think, but here is some information from our website on how you can stay up to date with future progress and announcements related to these funds. You can read on this website a brief summary of the funding opportunities that we're actively working on. And our blog has a periodic future-focused update providing context to Oregon's grant-seeking efforts. We also have links to resources provided by other entities, such as a guidebook that has been put out by the White House and frequently asked questions from the IRS related to tax credits. And then I also want to point out that there is a link on this website to a Q&A portal. So if you have a question that you didn't get a chance to ask today, or maybe you have one afterwards that you didn't think of, or you would like to request a letter of support for a grant under these programs, or discuss a partnership opportunity, you can complete the forms in the portal and we will be in touch. We really want to hear from you. And lastly, we recommend that you sign up for email updates. As we receive new information, we'll send notices through email to individuals who signed up to receive the federal funds update. All right. Here are 2 upcoming events that you're welcome to join if you want to hear more. Jen will be participating in an Oregon Public Utility Commission meeting on March 7th. So she'll be presenting alongside some investor-owned utilities and the Energy Trust of Oregon to share how the investments are shaping our planning efforts as we look to the future. And then we also plan to host a second hearing on our application for grid resilience in March. We anticipate posting a revised version of the program narrative at the end of the month prior to submission to U.S. Department of Energy, and more information will be available on our website in the weeks to come on that. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Again, feel free to raise your hand or put it in chat. I realized looking back at the questions from chat earlier, someone had asked a question for homes in here. Do we know if these will be administered through ODO or through a nonprofit like Energy Trust? And the short answer is we don't know yet. We are awaiting guidance from the U.S. Department of Energy on these programs. So Jen mentioned earlier that because those programs were passed in the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a budget reconciliation bill, the legislature or Congress was not able to put a lot of information within the statute. And so USDOE needs to take the limited guidance they got from Congress and put together program guidance and send it out to us. That's hopefully coming this spring. Then once we have that information, we'll be able to make determinations like who and how these funds will be administered and who will do it. But our goal, again, going back to those strategic intentions, is to build on existing programs, create efficiencies where possible. And there are certainly a lot of nonprofits who've been working in this space in the past that we'll want to work closely with. All right, Ruchi, I will turn it back to you to let me know if there are other questions. Oh, and I see Stephanie Cruz, thank you, put in the chat, we're currently collecting feedback on the Homes and HERA programs. So the U.S. Department of Energy put out a request for information from states and other interested parties on ideas for program design, and we are putting together a response to that. and we welcome your thoughts. You're welcome to respond to the RFI directly or share your thoughts with us, and we can integrate them into the state's response to that RFI. So she's offered to take suggestions in the chat, or I think you can also enter them through the portal on our website. Other questions?
So far, not seeing any raised hands, but getting some information in the chat now. So one is from Tim about curiosity in terms of any new or helpful pieces of information in the announcements from EPA. Any change in thinking from our end for those announcements. I'll let Jen and Janine think about that before we go to the next one from Bill.
I'll let Jen start since she attended the webinar this morning.
Yes, so there were actually 2 different webinars from the US EPA today. One was on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the other was on the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund. And I think some of the most helpful bits of information were some additional information as to how the climate pollution reduction grants are anticipated to work and some of the timelines that will be moving forward on those. So we do anticipate for that particular fund that initial guidance will come out on March 1st, and they will start with a planning grant phase. And from the planning grants, it will be a non-competitive process, which I still think there are quite a few questions about how exactly that process will work. But essentially, there will be funds available to enter into planning grants, but shortly following on the heels of that, in approximately the summer, will be the start of the implementation grants under the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund. And the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund will be coming a little bit later than that, starting approximately in the summer. So we're gearing up for a pretty busy spring and summer. And I know at ODO we'll be working closely with the Department of Environmental Quality as we work through and best assess how these funds could be used or leveraged for Oregon. But I know other entities are eligible for parts of these funds as well. So, you know, it's not something that necessarily has to flow only through the state agencies.
Great.
I will just add, ODO during the request for information phase with the EPA worked with DEQ on a letter to EPA encouraging them to set the program up in a way that potentially enabled states like Oregon that already have a lot of existing programs and plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to access some of those implementation dollars earlier. We think more climate pollution reduction planning is really good, and the state, you know, could always do more collaboration and coordination on planning. And we have a recommendation in our biennial energy report to do some of this. But we also think that the EPA could, you know, be able to support immediate greenhouse gas reductions by allowing us to access some of those implementation dollars to fund existing programs at the state.
Great. Thanks, Janine. There was a question about how we talked earlier about collaboration with different agencies and energy efficiency stakeholders. And the question is, with the HERA rebates being point of sale in the form of a discount, whether ODO is working with state contractors, the implementation of rebate funds, and whether discussions on how the influx of demand might affect supply and equipment costs. So 2 questions there on working with contractors and then thinking about supply and equipment costs with that demand.
Excellent question. And I do think these are all topics that Stephanie and others on the team are working through as we respond to the request for information. And I think maybe this is an area where we know we'll need to do some more engagement as we get more information from the federal government on how US DOE is expecting us to deal with point of sale rebates and potentially have some guidance on working with contractors.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Another question from Michael in reference to the grid resilience funding. And the question is whether that would only go to utilities or will funding also go to nonprofits and community-based organizations? And it might be a little confusing because I know there's several parts to that. So it might be worth just maybe talking a little bit about the different types and what the eligibility is.
Great question. The grid resilience funding that we talked most about today is allocated to the Oregon Department of Energy on a formula basis. So that's $50 million. And there's a list of eligible entities that we are able to subgrant that to. I believe it is broader than utilities, but I'm looking at Jen to see if she remembers off the top of her head. But there is information, I think, on our website where you can dig down it and find this.
Yeah, so under the grid resilience application, it is primarily referencing entities that we would recognize as our utility providers in Oregon. There is an option to identify other types of applicants, but that is something we'd have to negotiate through our application process with the U.S. Department of Energy. So if that's something that folks are interested in, we'd highly recommend to take a look at our program narrative once that is published and provide public comment on that through our process. As you know, even once that's published as a draft, it will still just be a draft and we'll be seeking additional input on that. With that, I will mention that all subrecipients will need to provide an additional match under the grid resilience that may vary based on their utility sales. So if there's an entity that doesn't necessarily have a sale, like a sale of electricity that we can point to, then we may have to figure out what a proxy would be and how to negotiate that match rate for other types of entities. So, but that's something that I think we are interested in hearing feedback on, particularly at our public hearing on March 15th.
Great, thanks, Jen. Another question coming in is whether we're seeing loans or even grants in any of the programs that could help contractors, especially contractors that may be from disadvantaged communities, scale up, and that could include equipment or working capital or help with hiring, so that they might be better able to meet this coming wave of activity. So, you know, just looking for, it looks like financial support for the contractors directly.
Great question. I'm going to let Jen answer that because she's been following the workforce opportunities more, but I do actually, no, I'm just going to let Jen answer it.
That's a great question. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, we do know there will be funding available to provide contractor training. We don't know exactly the full extent of that, and it is intended to go to complement the work under the residential energy efficiency upgrade programs, the Homes and HERA rebate programs. There's a lot we don't know. One of the major things we still don't know is whether or not these funds would be available formula to every state that expects to receive funds under Homes and HERA, or if it's something we may have to compete for as a state in order to access those funds. So that's something we'll be watching for. But I will mention in part of our attempts to coordinate across agencies, we've started conversations and we'll likely have more with other agencies like Business Oregon that may be able to have offer financing programs for particularly traded sector businesses that we may be able to find ways to refer different types of contractors to access existing programs that they may otherwise have not known about. So we'll be looking for those kinds of opportunities too to help our workforce and our business expand to meet the needs.
And I will just add that I was in DC last week and I talked with officials from EPA and DOE, and there is really a strong commitment to that Justice 40 and a strong commitment to making sure these funds get to communities who need it the most and communities that may not have been able to access opportunities like this in the past. And they seem very open to ideas. So I would encourage you, Tim and others, to respond to requests for information and share that this is an issue that, or an area that you think would be good for additional investments. And if you have specific types of activities or amounts of funding, I really think they're looking for ways to get this money to the people who need it the most.
Thanks, Janine and Jen. I'm not seeing any hands yet. People have been maybe thinking about more in the chat, so we can give folks a little bit more time to think if they have more questions at this point.
So I think with that, maybe since we're not seeing any more questions in the chat or hands raised, we can move to our questions for you at the end and a few more polls, and then Odo staff are available to hang out until for some more time if people have questions that they think of while the polls are going on. So with that, I will ask Stacy to launch one of those other polls. The one that I jumped the gun on earlier. Okay, did you find this webinar helpful now that we've gone through the whole thing? Be honest, you won't hurt our feelings. And the next question will be, would another webinar be helpful? And then we'll get at what other information would be helpful. So if you did not find it helpful, please feel free either in the chat or in the portal to let us know what we could do to make it more helpful in the future. All right, thank you to those of you who are responding. We'll give another 10 seconds or so. Looks like most people found it somewhat helpful. That's good. It's generally how I feel after the webinars that we're hearing from the federal agencies. Yeah, somewhat helpful. All right, thank you. And next question is, would another webinar be helpful? So this would be on a particular topic, or maybe in a month or two once we get more guidance from the federal government. We're happy to keep doing these as long as we have new information to share. Looks like most people would want to do this again. Okay, we'll give folks 5 more seconds. All right, we have one more question for you, and that is, what other information would you find helpful? And this one, you can type your answer and send it. I don't know if everybody else is seeing the results, but I had to enter a test one so that I could see them. All right, more specific details on some of these programs. How to form partnerships with Odo for resource sharing rollout. That's a great idea. Or we'll leave this one open for a while if people want to think about it. Can you contact people in other state agencies? Great. Yep. Paul, feel free to get in touch through our portal if you have a specific question about a specific agency, and we can get you to the right people. Structured implementation and workflow and a timeline for kickoff. Yes, that would be fantastic. A lot of that is still unknown. Partnerships. Absolutely. Yep, great point on the narrowing down to specific opportunities. Hearing that, thank you. Innovative approaches. I think that would be a great place to hear ideas from you all. I see that Tim Miller snuck a question into the poll response. Do we see Odo's previous loan programs being reopened to serve some of the opportunities in these programs? Tim, not at this point. We would need legislative authority and borrowing authority for the small scale energy loan program, which is hasn't made any loans since 2015. We don't have the expertise and staffing here at the agency anymore. But there are some financing programs like a revolving loan fund that we are thinking about and talking to our sister agencies about, because it would be great to be able to bring some of that funding to the state. Integrating Oregon's climate change goals and greenhouse gas reduction with funding projects. Yes, absolutely. I think that's guidance coming from the federal government is this funding has to work towards greenhouse gas reductions. So that'll definitely be a part of it, part of our work. I don't know if it's too much multitasking, but we can maybe leave this poll open for a minute and go back and see if anybody had any additional questions that they thought of. You want to put in the chat or raise your hand.
So far, no questions in the chat or raised hands.
Great. Well, we'll leave this webinar open and the poll up for another few minutes, but I'll just close by saying thank you for attending. Thank you for your interest in these programs and in the work that the Oregon Department of Energy is doing, and for your partnership on these opportunities. We are really excited about this. It's a bit overwhelming with the amount of funding, federal funding coming our way, but it's a huge opportunity for the state to make significant progress on our clean energy and climate change goals. So Jen or Ruchi, any final words of wisdom from either of you?
Nope, just thanks for coming to join us today.
Thank you.
All right, well, again, we'll be on here for a couple more minutes, but we're done with our program. So if you need to jump off, we understand. Thanks again for being here.
Looks like there might be a hand raised here for Tim. And Tim, it looks like you're unmuted.
I wondered, I thought I'd wait till most people go since I've been asking a lot of questions, but since you're staying on so nicely, Jen, I wonder if you could touch a little further on the slide you covered on the CPRG and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. You mentioned some stuff there pretty quickly and I didn't quite catch it.
Sure, I can try to. So there was a webinar I attended earlier today, and under the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund, let's see if I can find that slide again here, which is the $5 billion one that's referenced here. And essentially, it sounds like they are planning to launch this in 2 different phases. The first one will be a non-competitive planning phase that they're intending to release roughly 250 million for planning activities. And then the remaining balance of that will be available for implementation grants to a much wider base of eligible applicants and on a competitive basis. And they referenced that being open as soon as summer of 2023. And so we may have planning activities going alongside implementation activities under the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund at the same time, potentially. And there will be one state, well, most likely, we will have a state agency that will be designated out of the governor's office to be the applicant for the planning portion of those funds. There may be some options for municipalities or tribes to also receive planning dollars as well, but it sounds like they are intending at least for each state to receive the funds if the state chooses to seek it. I'm not sure if there's something specific you're looking for that I might be able to add on to that.
I was really also looking at the second part there, just if there's any new thinking that you know of about you know, public and private partners. I'm obviously tracking some of those conversations and just wanted to on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and Green Bank that you mentioned here.
Sure. So there was also a webinar on that one today as well. And one of the things that I think was kind of a highlight that came across for us from those webinars was that there's a $7 billion that will be available to one group of entities, which includes states, and then that there's really a strong emphasis on solar related programs in that $7 billion. And then there is the remaining $20 billion available to you know, different types of entities that it appears states are not at least directly eligible for. And it seems as though that the option for the $7 billion is likely to move faster potentially, or at least get the guidance out sooner than the remaining 20 billion. It seemed like there were still quite a few more questions around that larger portion. One of the things they did mention was that it could be available to financing institutions of all sizes and colors. I believe I hope is the correct wording that they used. So that does kind of give us an idea that it sounds like EPA is planning for some flexibility and how they think about the financing portion under that $20 billion for the Greenhouse Gas Fund.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the questions, Tim. I think it makes for a more engaging webinar. So thanks for asking them. Not seeing any more hand raise or things in the chat, and it looks like the participant list is kind of dropping off too.
All right. Well, then I think we can close the webinar. And again, really appreciate people's time, and thanks to the Odo staff for being here and being part of it, answering questions and presenting. Bye.